Good afternoon, Yasmine, Bouzoraa. Very welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. Magali Eben and myself run a series of conversations with PhD researchers with a dual purpose. First of all, to learn about your research because you're doing some groundbreaking study in a specific area of competition law and policy. And secondly, to discuss the issue of doing PhD in this very unusual time and how many interesting good and bad practices you can share with your peers. And we will try to make this conversation as easygoing as possible because we want to learn from you. And maybe we can start with asking you to introduce yourself. Yasmin, maybe we can start with you.
Yes, thank you. So my name is Yasmine Buozoraa. I'm a PhD student at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, and my research focuses mainly on the intersection between EU competition law and EU constitutional law, I would say.
Thank you. Kina?
Thank you very much. Nice to meet you. My name is Zheng. Now I'm final year PhD at Maastricht University. My research topic is the use of competition soft law in digital market, and I make comparative analysis between the EU and China. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Looking forward to hearing both of you discuss your research and your experiences. So maybe, Yasmin, we can start with you and you can tell us a little bit about your research project.
Of course. So my research is about finding the boundaries to the judicial lawmaking authority of the Court of Justice, and specifically within the EU competition law area. So what I try and look at is not whether the Court of Justice is making too much law or whether it should be less, but more to kind of almost empirically analyze it. So what is the extent of the lawmaking of the Court of Justice? And does this fit within the boundaries of its authority, like within the treaties, but also the boundaries conceptualized through legal theory, essentially? So that's what I've been doing over the past 2 years now, and I'm looking forward to doing that over the next few years as well.
And you start your research with one of your pieces with a very categorical, very elegant, I must say, but not non-ambiguous statement that the court single-handedly created a new legal order. Is it your starting point with Van Gennen laws and Costa NL cases? Is it the starting point of your research? And do you share, is this vision shared by, is it a consensual approach or vision, or you have different people disagreeing with such a rather bold vision approach?
So I would say most people would agree that the court has really shaped the European Union as it stands now, and that without Van Genten laws and COSNL, EU law wouldn't be as practical. It wouldn't be possible to apply it very practically in the national legal orders. So in that sense, I would say that the court has created single-handedly a new legal order, which wasn't really talked about before Van Genten laws and COSNL. Does it come from thin air? Probably not. Of course, there were treaties, there was law that the court went off, so it's not like they just made it up completely and it came out of nowhere. But I think it's really interesting how the court has had this role in the shaping of the European Union, and maybe how now there might be some backlash coming from that, specifically from, well, countries such as Hungary and Poland. They're unhappy with how the EU, as they say, I don't want to say whether they are right or wrong, but they say, well, the EU has spun out of control of what we envisioned it to be, even though they joined quite late on in the process, and they were joining far after Van Genten laws and COSNL. So there's that. But yeah, I would say that is my starting point. And just to analyze how did the court shape EU law, and specifically EU competition law, and is that traceable back to the law, the treaties, essentially? Yeah.
I think this is a very interesting question, particularly in our day and age. And in the writing you sent us, which was really well written and fascinating, you referred to the legitimacy of the Court of Justice and the EU as a whole and democracy. You give yourself a very impressive goal that you'll reconcile the Court of Justice with democracy. So I was wondering if you could reflect a bit on this, maybe as a broad idea with regard to citizens or the member states, but also whether you think in our current day and age that has a different connotation than at the time of Van Gent and laws.
Yes, thank you. That's a very good question. So what I mean, I guess, when I say democracy in the sense of my thesis is mainly the separation of powers, and that is on a horizontal and on a vertical level, so between the EU institutions and between the EU and the member states. And so what I want to look at is whether that division of powers is really respected by the court, and to what extent should it respect that division, or can it actually say some things about policy areas that are maybe not entirely sorry, my cat is climbing my bookcase.
We love pets. We love pet bombing.
She's a bit she's very small, but a bit annoying. So essentially, what I want to look at is whether that division of powers is really respected by the court and to what extent it should be respected. So can the court maybe judge some things that are technically in policy areas that overlap in terms of competences? So partly full competences of the union, partly full competences of the member states, or shared competences. So where does the court have competence to judge a case, essentially, and where should it take a step back? And I think that's all very much related to democracy. And I feel like democracy is kind of a buzzword now in political discourse in the Netherlands, but also throughout the EU, I would say, and that some people would say that the EU maybe is not as democratic as it pretends to be, because, well, the court does this, it goes beyond its authorities, that's not democratic, etc. And the people kind of lost control over what the EU is. And I think it's important not really to prove or disprove that point, but maybe to clear up what democracy means in this concept and what the influence or the role of the court is within that system of democracy. So it's not so much about saying, again, the court is good or the court is bad, but more about placing it in the context of the democracy or the democratic system of the union.
If you look at this process as acknowledging that the Court of Justice of the European Union does shape law in many respects, it's kind of in a locomotive of European integration, traditionally at least. Does it presuppose, from kind of more sociological perspective, the awareness, self-awareness of the judges that they are contributing? Is it because traditionally the familiar should be, with closed eyes. You have to be focused on the case and examine the case, try to discover the justice or whatever your kind of navigation, normative navigation is, regardless of the context. Dural ex, whereas here somehow this presupposes some continuity, some agenda setting, some creative design and role. Do you think, from your observations, from your intuition, from your reading and engaging with literature and maybe with judges themselves, is this there? Is this are these elements present in this constellation?
So from what I understand, I've only spoken about this with judges informally, so I can't really make any proper conclusions at this point, but from what I understand, the judges are very aware of their role within that democratic system of the European Union. And some have opinions about what that should be, whether they should show more restraint or whether they should really focus on European integration. But of course, the Union doesn't know a system of dissent opinions. So it is hard to know how much of that personal conviction of certain judges goes into the final judgments, because they're unanimous, essentially. So from those conversations, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure they're aware of their role. They're very clever people, usually. And for example, the president of the Court of Justice, Koen Leenaerts, he has written a lot about this topic, specifically, well, now as well, but when he was a PhD student, he wrote a very big book about exactly this topic. So I'm sure that he has thought about the position of the court and will place himself in that system. But also, of course, there is the thing that we have a case-by-case system in the court, and that makes sense because if you're a judge, you have to judge the facts before you. And I think that influences to some extent also how you judge a case and what things you take into account, essentially. So yes, I think some judges have some focus on European integration, but I think it's not always the case that they would push it just for the sake of pushing it. That doesn't seem fair to me, I would say.
Just off the top of my head, and just tell me if you haven't thought about this yet, but is there a difference, do you think, in the level of activism or particularly opposition to decisions of the court, depending on the areas in which the judgments take place? So there's more and more topics that make its way to the court, right? So the hardcore free movement competition cases are no longer the only cases that the court looks at. Do you think this has an impact? Is this something you will consider, particularly with how competition evolves or the court's jurisprudence evolves?
I'm not 100% sure yet in terms of competition law. I know that some other authors have looked at different policy areas. For example, Filia Velivite, she's, I think, at the University of Reading at the moment. She has written an incredible book about 4 policy areas. So that would be things like education, healthcare, gambling. And she looks at the different types of policy area, and then her conclusion is that yes, in most areas the court is more activist, and then in some it will show more restraint. I'm not 100% sure why. My first guess would be that some policy areas are more, well, sensitive, if you will. So, for example, gambling, I would assume the court holds back a little bit because it's a more sensitive societal topic. Yeah, in terms of competition law, I'm not sure at this point. I hope to find out.
And if you mentioned when answering Magali's question, when we were discussing democracy, I imagine this kind of linear understanding of liberal democracy presupposes electoral process, and the constituency somehow shape and channel your agenda and your kind of program and your priorities. Whereas when judges are mindful in one way or another, directly or not, about their kind of mission of being players, not purely adjudicators in this technical mechanistic sense, well, it's not mechanistic, but narrow sense, but rather co-creators of this sui generis legal system, they are still democratically, or they're part of this democratic system. And I understand from your engagement with legal philosophers, you are one of those competition scholar who tries to get this wisdom from legal philosophers, that there are ways of democratic ruling without necessarily receiving kind of legitimate mandate from elector during the elections, but you somehow absorb the societal interests and channel them, process them in a different way. So I wanted to ask you which legal scholars you try to bring to the discussion, which may be legal theoretical traditions or legal philosophical traditions, and how precisely you engage with them.
Right, thank you. So yeah, the legal theory has definitely been a challenging part of this endeavor, I would say, because there's just so much of it. And sometimes it's hard to pick which parts I do engage with and then which parts I don't. So as of now, I think the main legal philosopher I engage with would be Waldron, and then Fallon, who opposes Waldron essentially. And that's much of the discussion about judicial review in general. So whether judicial review in the broad sense is a good thing or not, and whether in that sense courts should show some restraint or not. And Waldron essentially says, well, we shouldn't have judicial review in the broad sense because, or in the strong sense, because there are many things that the judiciary cannot fix that we expect it to fix. For example, the judiciary is not able to just decide on what's right or wrong because they are people and we give them these issues and they can say, okay, we think it should be that way or that way, but ultimately the people have already decided what they wanted. And an argument against that would be that the people is always the majority, and then the others that don't fall within that majority are kind of overruled by that majority. So he really answers that point by saying, well, yeah, but the judges would still be possibly a part of that majority, so they don't necessarily protect the minorities, essentially. So he's really against the broad sense of judicial review, and he says we should focus more on the process in which rules come to be, essentially. So what I try and do with that argument is not so much try and quantify it, but I try to create a context in which this discussion kind of lives. And then I use some other thinkers that try and quantify judicial lawmaking as such, or they call it judicial activism. So they kind of, yeah, come up with different parameters to measure the judicial lawmaking. I'm trying to use that to apply to the case law of the Court of Justice and then kind of measure to what extent does the Court of Justice make the law. But the problem I'm currently running into and that I'm currently trying to solve is that I need to adjust the system because it's very US focused. So it's about dissent opinions and we don't have those. So I need to kind of change that a little bit to fit the European model, and then I am hoping to use that mainly to essentially quantify the case law of the Court of Justice as much as possible. So that would be mainly Lingfist and Cross that I'll try and use essentially.
That's a very ambitious plan, and I think it's a really fascinating thing to be doing. So I look forward to reading it when you're done. And so maybe, just to start explaining to us how you're doing this, maybe you can explain a little bit more about what the difference is between, more of a judicial review based on whether the process is proper, there are no errors of law, versus, judicial lawmaking or judicial activism in substance. And I know that you're still trying to quantify it, but can you think of an example where maybe there was opposition to the Court of Justice as being too much of a lawmaker, or particular example of a case where you're not sure whether it's process-based review or lawmaking, or what is your thinking with regards to EU jurisprudence?
Thank you. So I would say that the difference can be kind of hard to pinpoint sometimes. I know that I would say the difference between the two essentially is that in the procedural review, you really look at whether the procedure was followed by the regulator or the legislator. And if so, and it fits within the boundaries of the law, so that also means fundamental rights, I would say, then that would be acceptable and you would let the decision pass, essentially. And if you review it more thoroughly, you would look at the broader context as well. So does it fit into the narrative, for example, of European integration? The problem is that European integration, many people would say, is part of EU law. So we want that ever closer union. Essentially, it's in the treaties. So it's hard to distinguish really between both things. And I think it would be hard for me to really pinpoint what is and what is not process-based or more substantively focused. The cases I know most people are quite angry about are usually not necessarily competition law cases. So it would often be rule of law cases, but often also because the court refuses to review something. So it's hard for me to say something about it now, but I think that would be the distinction. And sadly, the distinction is not super clear. So I will have to clear that up before I actually can do something with it.
Yes, when you introduce something related to the judicial lawmaking, I was wondering that have you think about that how this kind of judicial lawmaking has some impact on the legal certainty and also predictability for like private actors, especially like undertakings?
Yeah, thank you. So I think actually this is a really important point, and I think that judicial lawmaking, if it goes outside of the boundaries of the authority of the court, or sometimes even if it stays within those boundaries, can lead to unexpected situations. And especially in competition law, where you have Article 101 and Article 102, specifically Article 102, which are very broadly phrased, and kind of unclear in what they do and do not regulate, if you will. So I think if the courts can go a lot of different ways with these provisions, then it will be hard for private actors to understand which way they're going to go, and how to kind of prepare themselves and change their behavior before a judgment. Because you also don't want a situation in which, yeah, undertakings cannot kind of predict what's going to happen with their behavior. And I think right now that's a problem. I know Magali has written about that as well, which is a very interesting article, which I would recommend. So yeah, I think that is a problem. But it's also, you know, a policy choice to make those provisions unclear. So maybe it's not fully on the court. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Kina mentioned private actors, and it came to my mind this line of scholarship where Tommaso Pavona being the most kind of known, at least for broader cycles, with his Ghostwriters text book, where basically he traces the evolution of the preliminary ruling mechanism or tool originating from a handful of big law firms where they essentially tailored the preliminary ruling text for national courts, nudging them to ask, because implying somehow that at the beginning of European integration, most of national courts were not even familiar with how to do it, what is acte claire, and etc. So this is kind of, and now we also see that, okay, the traditional larger influencers like media is fourth power, but now with social media, we see different other stakeholders somehow engaging in or co-engaging, co-contributing into shaping the discussion, so to say. Do you try to reflect upon these less measurable elements of co-contributing, co-nudging, somehow influencing judges' breakfast, so to say, actors and processes?
Not really. So I know of the book. I haven't read it. It's on my to read list, so I can't really reflect much on it. I've heard it's incredible, so I'll have to give it a read. but it kind of falls outside of the scope of my research because it's not so much focused on the court and more on other actors outside of the court that may influence the court. But to kind of encompass all of that within my research, it would be too big of a project and it would be too difficult for me to kind of distinguish again between what is the court and what is influences on the court. And where is that distinction? So for future projects, I would be interested in that, but for now, it falls outside the scope.
I know we're asking too many questions. Maybe to roll out and move into Kina. Also, Kina, it would be interesting to hear your views about you as a legal comparatist. You know the systems, how it functions in China. Do you see some elements of this in Chinese legal order, or maybe in any other, or European Union is such a specific model that it's mainly present in the EU context? And last question, you cannot resist the temptation, Yasmine. Google Shopping, you have published recently a piece on it. We have this decision, the judgment being already supposedly closing the file, all tried, leaving aside private actions. Your quick maybe comments, are you happy with it? Is it in line with your predictions, understanding of things?
So I haven't fully read the whole thing, so I can't say whether I'm fully happy or fully unhappy or somewhere in the middle. I think there are certain things that I'm happy the court addressed, such as, for example, how Bronner should be dealt with in the context of Google Shopping. I think it's much clearer in this judgment than it was in the general court's judgment. So I think that's good because it clears up what Bronner means in this context and what it means in the future. So that might help legal certainty in the future, I would say. For the other aspects, I can't fully comment at this point.
Yes, actually, from my perspective, because during my PhD research, I did a comparative analysis between EU and China, but my research mostly focused on the field of competition law. So I would like to say that I see there are some similar issues between the EU and China. For example, all these big techs brought these challenges to the institutions in both two jurisdictions. And I also see some differences between these two jurisdictions. For example, in digital market, we see that in the EU, there are more like international or foreign undertakings, which take the dominant in the EU market. For example, Google holds like 90% of the market share in the European in the European general search market. But in China, my observation is that most of these big tech companies are actually native companies, which means that they belong to, they are Chinese companies. So from these different structures of the digital market, I also see that there are some differences between like legal framework in the competition law and also the development of the cases in China. For example, in the abuse of dominance, I see that Chinese competition authority, SAMR, has also adopted three decisions to impose fines against the big tech companies like Alibaba case. But in this case, I also see that the Chinese authorities are trying to make their enforcement, trying to make their implications of the new competition law more efficiency. So they're trying to select maybe one primary illegal conduct or actions that taken by these big techs, and to quickly reflect on that what happens in digital market. So this is, I saw that's the difference with the EU, because we see that in the Commission's decisions related to like Google, like Apple, there are like several actions or several conducts that has trying to be investigated by the commission, so which also may take more time for the commission to reflect to the risk that happens in digital market. And for the courts, that I feel that this is also something different, because in the EU we see that the Court of Justice really give I think it's quite a lot of interpretations of the enforcement of competition law, but this part I think is a lack of in the Chinese part, because now we see that there are although we have this kind of decisions that's adopted by the Chinese Competition Authority, but we see that these undertakings, they actually give up their right to bring a litigation to the Chinese court, and finally there is a stop at the end of these decisions be published. So now we have no case that's how this how the Chinese courts reflect on the SAMR's decision. But on the other side, I also collect all the judgments given by the courts between private actors, like the two undertakings or one nature person who bring litigations to the court related to undertakings that like related to Alibaba. So I think this is also some improvement in practice.
I have recently seen a reflection where a scholar has demonstrated, obviously selectively, the response of Amazon to the FTC opening the case, where the message was that you will be ruining the markets, etc. And then the response of Alibaba to the Chinese Competition Authority, where they start with saying, we are very grateful for channeling our understanding, for helping us to understand better the specificity of the markets, etc. So this somehow reflects the soft law power, yeah. And for me, the soft law in this uncharted waters of shaping competition in digital markets plays a pivotal role. And I understand, if I understand it correct, so I wanted to check it with you actually, Kena, that in order to play this game using soft law tools, you need very powerful underpinning, so to say. You need something which is present invisibly as a strong power, and where all parties somehow know that you can use it, but nobody wants you to use it, including yourself, because you prefer, as an enforcer, also softer instruments. Let us do it in a more kind of regulatory dialogue fashion. So can you elaborate? The question consists of two parts. Is it correct that this is within this kind of Chinese regulatory philosophy almost, A, and B, is it applicable to regulating digital markets?
Yes, from my opinion, and I really think that if we talk about how this soft law plays its role in digital markets, it's really related to that how we say about soft law. I think this is not soft law is not start from the digital market regulation of digital markets. It's actually maybe 20 or 30 years ago. There is also soft law in international law, where it starts. So I say that soft law is not only used as like a regulatory tools, not only like a regulatory tools, it's also like to interpret or explain that how hard law and how this regulatory framework should moving on. For example, in my research, I show that there are two different regulatory strategies. One is like the EU, who firstly adopted the hard law like the DMA. And then we see that in DMA, there are also one articles who indicate that in the future, the Commission will publish guidelines to explain how some vague provisions of DMA can be explained and can get the enforcement of law by competition authorities, and also lead the way for private for undertakings. And I see another strategy, regulatory strategies, which can be say also in China, that we have firstly the platform guidelines, which the full name is anti-monopoly guidelines for regulate the platform economy. So this is soft law. But for soft law, because this rules has no legally binding force, so you don't have like a state enforcement rules to make it be used by both the authorities and also by the courts. But I see that with this soft law instruments, China has already, based on their experience in practice, because this soft law has been adopted in 2021 February. And then 1 year later, we have amended the anti-monopoly, which is a hard law and is a basic law in the field of competition law. So this law has been amended. And with this hard law, we also see that there are some provisions and approaches that's provided by soft law has been incorporated in this hard law, which means that this soft law actually provide the information and provide some explanations of how the competition authority, they want the competition law to be formulated in the future. And this also give the competition authorities for like 1 or 2 years to implicate this soft law and let the digital market to know that to know the signal of what will happen. And now we see that in China there are also 3 secondary legislation has been also updated based on the soft law and also hard law. So I see there are actually 2 regulatory strategies, but I don't think this is only happens in China for the later strategies. This is not only China who firstly published soft law and then trying to update its hard law. I see also like South Korea, which also firstly published guidelines, and also like Japan, they also published 1 guidelines this year. And also we heard from the Japanese scholars, they feel that the cultures in Japan is more suitable to provide a soft law to make all these informations, all make rules very clear. But this is hardly to be conducted by the hard law, especially in digital markets, because we see that in digital markets, the first development of the technology makes the hard law quite weak, and also the provision of hard law should be interpreted in the future. So with this kind of context in this digital markets, I couldn't see that which strategies is better, like the EU is better or China is better. I see that maybe their authorities has already think about which rules is more fitable or may more could work in their markets and also in their regulatory framework.
And obviously, we all are very much interested in the regulatory novellas, solutions, know-how introduced or experiment or tested, which are tested by different jurisdictions, because it's such a kind of unknown territory, digital markets. We in European Union, in the United Kingdom, came up with the Digital Markets Act and its UK equivalent, which is very original regulatory mechanism, hybrid mechanism, different to ex post competition law, definitely. And I wonder what is the situation in China? Do you discuss? There were discussions about introducing something of the DMA style. Is it a mature discussion? How far is it developed? What are the main stakeholders? What is the tonality? What is the atmosphere of these conversations?
I do feel that in China, there are some discussions between scholars about whether or not China also needs a hard regulatory tool like the DMA. But I feel that this is not take on the table of the competition authorities, because as I mentioned before, China has already had this kind of legal framework in the field of competition law to regulate digital markets. And I also feel that from the Asian perspective, I also do not say that there is a signal that's like Singapore, like South Korea or Japan, they are trying to formulate a similar rule like the DMA. I think on the one hand, it's because they are also trying to explore it that's necessary to have the similar rules as a DMA, because we know that this is a quite hard rules to regulate the digital markets, and maybe some jurisdictions still thinking about how to balance the innovation and also regulation. So I think that's for China, now it's a time for them maybe to think about and to explore whether or not there is a necessary. So we all look forward how it will be enforced in the EU, and to see that how the EU can balance this this kind of tension. So I think that maybe in the future, if they think this is necessary, maybe this will be put forward again. Yeah.
It is quite fascinating to think about using soft law instead of going through the legislative process. Now, bearing that in mind, I know that the amendments in China to the anti-monopoly law, like including the innovation objective, which I think is really fascinating, is the adoption of hard law. But it's not the same as adopting a completely new type of regulation. And in your work that you sent us, you make this distinction between going through the legislative process to create new laws, where soft law can then shed light, interpret the new laws, versus a situation in which you don't adopt a completely new regulation, but you use soft laws really to come up with new principles and new rules in the absence of going through the legislator. And I was wondering, also because there's a connection with what Yasmine was saying, whether you've had some thought about maybe the legal certainty, the predictability of each approach, but also I think whether this kind of depends on the context. The way we understand legal certainty in the EU and how important we may or may not find that might be different from the way it's considered in China. So I don't know if you've got some reflections on that.
Well, thank you for your question. Actually, it's quite a lot of questions inside it. I feel that it's very interesting, and also it's really related to some of the observations in my research. First of all, I see that your question actually related to both like procedure roles of soft law and hard law, and also the substantive content of these two regulatory tools. From the procedure perspective, I feel that we know that for the formulation of hard law legislations, there is a clear rules like the legislative procedure. And also there is a soft law named the better regulation guidelines. This is also trying to guide the Commission how to make a proposal for legislation. And one of my draft paper trying to explore what the differences between these procedures to formulate a hard law and a soft law in the field of competition law. From my research, I feel that at least from the Commission side, from the DG competition side, for the formulation of soft law, they also opened public consultations for each of soft law formulation. So I think in this perspective, they are trying to ensure the legitimacy between. This is not a full legitimacy, but they are trying. So from this perspective, I feel that soft law is not totally like trying to fund the back door of the legitimacy, and trying to avoid of the parliament, because you need to have some softer rules to give more explanations. And also especially when in the field of competition law, there are more complex issues from the economic perspective, from technology perspective. There definitely needs some expertise from the digital competition to make the rule more clear for undertakings in the future. So from the procedure perspective, I do agree that the procedure is not such clear and is not fully regulated as a hard law, but I see the improvements, at least from the digital competition. And also from the substantive content, I feel that as I mentioned at the beginning, it really depends on what's the role of soft law, what we expected from the soft law. If we expected soft law to just interpret it, complement hard law, then I think the things will be easier. If we want a soft law to be like to impose some hard obligations for undertakings like gatekeepers, then I think the discussion and also the debates will definitely rise up, because we feel that there are some additional hard rules for undertakings. So in this perspective, I feel that I feel that To be honest, I also remember that when I make a comparison between you and China, I was thinking that that if China makes soft law firstly, it means that they are trying to use these soft rules to avoid of legislation procedures and make some leeways for them to impose hard obligations. But I was thinking that if there is no rules, if there is a regulatory gap for us to regulate the digital market for undertakings, why not firstly to provide some soft law to give some information to lead the undertakings to well behave. So I think in this perspective, I don't say that Chinese soft law has some has not followed the legal principles or the legal rules. Actually, it's still in the legal rules because there are some regulatory gaps. Then we need to use soft law to complement, to map these gaps and to provide the information for undertakings.
Can I ask you a question about the state of affairs in the digital markets themselves? So each core platform service is different in the European Union context. In the context of DMA, you sense different dynamics, different situation, etc. But there is a common denominator. We understand that the markets are deeply entrenched, and that some regulatory boost is necessary just to trigger competition, so to say, metaphorically speaking. Again, using another stereotype, we understand that in China, you have in pretty much all core platform services, you have domestic operators, strong, super heavyweight players, but you also have, in one form or another, traditional global big tech players like Big Five or Big Six. So one might imply that at least competing between themselves, regardless, leaving aside who gets what priorities in what markets or not, there is another element of competition which is missing in Europe between domestic strong big tech and the global big tech, let's say. So does it create additional competitive dynamic which is missing in the European Union, and thus maybe makes it less necessary to look at the horizontal dimension of Chinese DMA, maybe the vertical dimensions of exploitation and fairness related obligations are as relevant as in the EU, but maybe horizontal dimension is less problematic. What do you sense as a comparative lawyer, again, not a comparative person? What is the situation in China in comparison to the situation in the European Union?
Actually, I have a similar feeling with you. That's because the competition conditions in these two jurisdictions are different, so which make the direction of the regulation also similar, slightly different. For example, we see that in the music streaming platforms, Spotify maybe have like over 50% of the market power in the EU, but in China we have 3 native companies who compete with each other in music streaming platform. One holds 35% of market share, one over 25, and one over 17. So I see that this native tech companies, they're trying to compete with each other. They're also trying to innovate something new to attract users' attention. From this perspective, I feel that the Chinese Competition Authority, they are also found out that there are some dynamic competitions between native platforms and also some platforms from other countries like Amazon also joined the Chinese market. So from this perspective, I feel that because there are more competitors in China's digital market, so which make the Chinese Competition Authority not such worries about how we can formulate this market and how we can ensure that startups can also join the market. And also, I feel that because the different culture between the EU and China, some Chinese, from one perspective, I feel that Chinese people, they are not so much nervous about their private data. So which means that the undertakings, they also have more space to to use this data to formulate, to establish their new ecosystem and to establish their new innovations.
I think these are really important reflections, because very often when we talk about Digital Markets Act and the so-called Brussels effect, there seems to be an almost assumption that other countries will follow in some fashion the DMA. I see this in a lot of PhD work as well. So I think it's really important what you're saying and asking those questions about what are the domestic differences in the market, but also in the culture. And I think the domestic differences in the market is something that we generally can talk about, but the culture and the expectations that citizens have of legislators, I think it's an important difference. And so I was wondering as well, from an institutional perspective. So you know, it's difficult sometimes for Europeans to really engage with what is happening in China. Not just is there a language barrier, but it can be difficult to understand what the institutional differences are, and also to get access to full decision making. So I was wondering, when you did this research, but also broader, is there something that you would say to people interested in the China-EU comparison? Are there differences in the way the Chinese authority works that you think are really crucial when we talk about soft law, digital market, or competition policy in general? And you can maybe also give a tip about how do we understand the Chinese decision making, because I will fully admit that I find it really hard.
Thank you very much for your question. I feel that when I start my comparative analysis, I feel that, oh, it's really hard because it's double my PhD work. Now I have like 13 chapters in my thesis because I want to introduce two jurisdictions, especially in their both legal framework and also public enforcement and also private enforcement. This really increase my work. But now after I have done all this kind of research, I feel that it's really valuable to doing a comparative analysis, especially between like European Union and also Asian country like China, which has different like the culture and the digital markets and also like institutions. The organization or the structure of the institution looks very similar, but maybe sometimes they share the different powers in some small perspective. And this kind of small thing is really relevant to how this law has been enforced and how the direction of the competition law is going. So I feel in this perspective, it's really valuable. And on the other side, when you ask me if I have some suggestion for the people who would like to conduct comparative analysis, I would like to say that you will definitely face a lot of difficulties, but it's worthwhile to do it because you will have more knowledge from the global perspective. And in the future, if you want to jump into another jurisdiction like the UK, US, then you will already have this kind of skill of how to doing this comparative analysis. You also have the broader aspect of which direction you need to firstly get into. So I think this is on the one hand to increase your knowledge, on the other hand, it's really increase your legal analysis skills. So I definitely encourage.
Your research is really interesting, and you talk about the differences in the institutions in the EU and China. And in your research, I saw that you write both about the regulator and the judicial approach to soft law in the area of competition law. And I was wondering, could you expand on that a little bit? Is there a difference between the two approaches, so that of the regulator and then the judicial branch? And how does that difference relate to the differences that you found between the EU and the Chinese approach to soft law in competition law?
Yes, I actually did both public enforcement and private enforcement in these two jurisdictions. In the EU side, I found that the competition, the Commission has actually not inconsistently used soft law in each of cases, in each of decisions that in digital markets. For example, during my research, I collected like 8 decisions in the abuse of dominance and 19 decisions in the mergers. I found that in this over 20 decisions, the commission actually use soft law like the competition soft law not inconsistently. For instance, when we thought about the notice on the market definition, I found that in the cases in the decisions related to abuse of dominance, these 8 decisions, 7 of them the commission explicitly referred to soft law, referred to the notice on the market definition, but in the Apple case, which is an exception because the commission didn't mention this notice. But I found that in the merger case, although there is also necessary for define the relevant market, but the commission actually only explicitly uses soft law in 4 decisions. So when I saw this kind of inconstant, not only for this notice on the relevant market, but also in the other soft law instruments has been adopted, I found that this kind of inconsistently use of soft law may produce some legal uncertainties for undertakings, because undertakings will confuse that whether or not they should follow soft law in some perspective. And also it makes them too difficult in predict how the commission will implicate soft law measures. And then when I look the private enforcement that's given by the Court of Justice, I found that it's surprisingly that in the commission's in the Court of Justice judgment, they actually explicitly use soft law measures more than commission. So I was thinking that if there's some like internal rules for them to decide whether or not use soft law in some conditions. I don't know, but I feel that in the future it will be very interesting to do some interviews or some empirical research on this perspective. But when I look how Chinese competition authority and how Chinese courts they use soft law, I also found that there are some differences. For example, the Chinese competition authority they actually explicitly use soft law in each of their decisions, which means that this soft law actually provide some legal certainties in this perspective. But also there is a risk whether or not there is something happens when this soft law impose the hard obligations, which means that it's also it's also a tension, you know, because on the one side we feel that this soft law used explicitly by the competition authority will increase the legal certainty, will help the undertaking to know that they need to follow soft law. But on the other side, it's also raised question about legitimacy and also whether or not this kind of soft law use can impose additional obligations for undertakings in the future. So I think that this kind of comparison make me make me understand that how these difficulties in deal with this soft law using issues and how different with these 2 jurisdictions when they when they use soft law and when they formulate soft law.
Great. I think we had 2 very promising and very informative, very enriching topics. Thank you very much for elucidating and highlighting so many interesting aspects of these 2 projects. And maybe we can revert now to a more kind of your experience as doing PhD, not the substance of your PhD, but the process, because it can be a real challenge and a great opportunity. So it's the most creative year supposedly. So what are your feelings? And maybe you can share with us some tips about your writing preferences, or how do you prefer to share your ideas, to test your ideas with 20 different peers, or rather keep it focused until you produce the publishable text? How do you engage with the university? Do they expect you to deliver a lot of, or tick a lot of boxes in terms of attendance or audit in different modules with only indirect relevance, but also enriching your research profile, whatever? Or it's rather doing PhD is the only activity? Anything which you would like to share with us, it would be really, really great. Maybe we can start with you, Yasmine.
Of course, thank you. So for the process as a whole, I tend to find it quite paralyzing sometimes, because I come from a master's, which had very clear goalposts. I needed to tick this box and then this box and then this box and then write a little thesis, and then that's the master's. And then I started the PhD, which is quite legal theory focused. And especially in the beginning, I was just so intimidated by all of these thinkers that have thought about these topics for 100 years or more, and just questioned whether I could add something to that at all. And I think sometimes I still feel that way, but you just focus on the little things. I think just take it step by step. And what I try and do mostly to help me write when I'm a little bit stuck is that I just sit down in the morning, I write 500 words, and they can be the worst words in the world, it doesn't matter. And then when I finish, I have still often a lot of the day left, and I can do something I really like and enjoy. And not that I don't enjoy my thesis, obviously, but more like hobbies essentially, and feel good about that I have done something. And then the next day I come back to what I wrote, rewrite it, and then write another 500 words. And in that way, I don't put the pressure of writing something perfect the first time on myself, and that really helps me relax in the process. So that's something I would recommend. In terms of my university, I would say that there's not that many boxes to tick, to be honest. So we have to get 30 study points over 4 or 6 years. I have a 6-year contract because I also have a lot of teaching obligations. So that is one thing that I do on the side, but that I also quite enjoy. Sometimes it does get a bit difficult to kind of divide my time over the two, set boundaries to what I can and cannot do, and to what takes too much time away from my research. So that can be a bit of a struggle, but I just highly would recommend talking about your expectations with your university, and then they can tell you their expectations, and that kind of clears up what you're supposed to do, but also doesn't leave you wondering all the time whether you do enough in your university aside from your research. In terms of the research, I am very much someone that works alone a lot and then puts something on paper and then present it to my peers, and then welcome comments when I feel ready to, I suppose, which at this point I do not fully in terms of all of the concepts that my thesis encompasses. But I try to put it down on paper first and then talk about it. But I think I should probably sometimes speak to others more about it, because it might untangle my thoughts a little bit more when I get a little bit stuck. Yeah, I think that's my main experience. But I do, that's all sounded really negative, but I do really enjoy the process. It's so much freedom, and yeah, you don't often get 4 or 6 years just to focus on one topic and really read everything there is. And yeah, it's an incredible experience, but sometimes a slightly scary one.
Fear is good, right? But you can't let it paralyze you. But I think it's really interesting what you said about, you working on your own and only showing really what you've done when you feel good and ready. And I was going to push back a little bit because I think there is a tendency with PhD students to believe that they are less ready than they are, especially, you've had this conversation with us and you've got some really interesting thoughts. So I would encourage you, but any other PhD student, to sometimes put ideas forward, even when they're half baked, right? Even when they're not ready yet. I think the most interesting conversations come from that, especially because the tendency that we see with some academics to only present their papers when they're done means that when they get comments, they fall apart because they thought that the piece was finished. And then you get comments and you think, well, no, it's finished and it's perfect, so you shouldn't have given me comments. So I think it might be better to sometimes to go earlier. And you've proven that you're more than capable of having this conversation. So in general, the lone island thing of academics, it's true. A lot of us work on our own a lot, but I also think there's a part of that is fear sometimes. So I just wanted to throw it out there.
Actually, I highly agree with Magali because I also feel that during my PhD, I joined a different academic group. One is between 4 universities in Netherlands and Belgium. It's named Youth Community, and we have like annual conferences. In these conferences, there is always a workshop on competition law that organized by like Professor Walter and also Professor Anna Gabrizi from Utrecht. And I feel that I learned a lot from these annual conferences because each of the year I can share some of my ideas with like draft papers, and they really give me lots of good comments, and not only negative, not negative actually at all. Actually, most of these comments are really construction suggestions. So I feel that I learned a lot from these conferences. And also since last year, I also attend Ascola, and also this year I feel I learned a lot from all these excellent competition lawyer, and I really enjoy these conferences because I feel that I know that what I should learn from them, and I get some feedback and also comments from them. So I think it's very useful. And I also see that doing PhD is really a valuable period that you are learning from, not from your supervisors, from your peers, from your colleagues, and also from these scholars that in the conferences you have met. So I feel that we have lots of pressures that's given by ourselves, that you want to finish your PhD on time, you want to have excellent publications, you want to teach and let students like you. I think all these pressures is given by yourself, that you want to be excellent scholars in the future. But I also see that during last 4 years, I'm not afraid to make mistake because I knew that now I'm not mature scholars. I'm just a junior scholars, want to learn more. So on the one hand, I give my space, I allowed myself to make some mistake, and on the other side, I trying to release some of the pressures. So I trying to have my own hobbies, like I play drums. Here, if you can see, I play drums, and also I like skiing during winter. So I think all of these kind of hobbies, they help me a lot to help me, help me a lot, especially during the winter in the Netherlands.
I think you're completely right. The one thing I want to throw out is that I sometimes learn more, sorry to all my friends and colleagues, sometimes learn more from people doing PhDs than I do from my peers. And the reason for that is that you are more sometimes, in the process of teaching yourself how to do research. So you come up sometimes with wild suggestions that I thought actually they might be more valuable than when I write down. So that this happens quite a lot, and in a way it's a good check, I think, on our thinking that we finally figured it all out. So I think it's good. And hobbies is very, very important. I think I need to remind myself that too. I need hobbies.
And I among other things, I have there is a long catalog of excellent tips and reflections which you have both shared. I really like the one where you imposing upon yourself the requirement to write X amount of words every morning, and not implying that this is the final text, just something which somehow, so you combine the formalism on one hand, but also kind of liberal treatment of yourself, where you say, okay, it's just, you don't have to perfectionize it the day one. So I think I combine this and I adopt these elements myself too. It's glad to see that we are on the same page in this regard. I try to recommend it to my students, and usually I see that not many buy this advice. Write in advance, put it on hold, then try to read it with fresh pair of eyes, etc. But yeah, I think it's a great conversation. Maybe you can also give us some update about software which you use or which you would somehow helps you to keep your literature in right order, or maybe some elements of purely technical digital skills which people who've been matured or raised as researchers are not using because they still remember how to access hard copies of text rather than doing things online. Is there anything at the top of your head which could be easily transposable to others?
I think from my side, that's I use ChatGPT, but I use it when I join some conferences because I feel that when you join the conferences or seminar or workshop, there will be some topic or will be some term that you are not fully understand. In this perspective, I will try to use ChatGPT to give me a first understanding of what it looks like, and I feel that if it's interesting, I will doing some research by myself. But I feel that it's useful when you do not know some topic or some research, then you can have a first impression of what it looks like. So I think if you could use it, it definitely will be a useful tool for your knowledge, for your research.
I would mainly use a footnote manager. ChatGPT, I think I should use it, but I just haven't gotten around to it. And with the footnote manager, it's been the same for a long time. My colleague has been saying for 2 years, you need to use a footnote manager, use Zotero, and I just refuse to learn it, even though it's not that difficult. And now that I am using it for a good few months, it's made my life so much easier. So I don't have to go back and change every footnote manually when I put another footnote in between two footnotes. So yeah, I would really recommend using that. And I know some of my colleagues use ChatGPT in the way that you do as well, and they always say, please use it this way. And I think it will most likely be the next thing I tackle again once I accept that I need to learn a new thing technically.
Kina Zheng, Yasmine, Bouzoraa, thank you very much indeed for being our guest with Magali, and it was a real pleasure to having a conversation with you and learning from you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Thank you very much for inviting us.